When you look at Alan Wake 2, it's very easy to see just a video game. After all, that is what it is. But it's not just that. There's something going on here that, without the right kind of eyes, is almost completely invisible. A sort of culmination of the developer's creative history. The loose, disparate ideas that we've encountered in previous Remedy titles forming a patchwork map leading to the only way this could have ever gone. A completely and totally unrestrained Remedy, whether that be for better or for worse. As I speak these words, Alan Wake 2 has been out for around 3 months, and since no one's expecting punctual content from this channel, that means I've had a lot of time to really think about it. Time to not only think about what it is, but where it came from. If you forced me to come up with a clickbaity, typical YouTuber quote, I'd say this is Remedy operating at peak Remedy, and hopefully throughout the course of this video, we can explain exactly what that mess of words even means. So if all of you would be so kind as to join me once again for another trip into the dark place, I've got a really great idea for a potential vacation spot. What's up, guys? I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews, and this is Remedy After Max Payne.
I don't want to slow you down.
Are you thinking of retiring? You know what happens to cops who say this is their last case.
Real funny, Anderson.
As I work on this video, it has been nearly 12 years since Remedy released Alan Wake, and yes, those old feelings that you're getting right now are 100% justified. Life is terrifying, but believe it or not, to some, there are things more scary than the conscious knowledge of your own mortality. Specifically, the idea of releasing a sequel to a game that hasn't seen any real action in more than a decade. I could list some specific examples here, but I assume everyone has theirs. Suffice it to say, Alan Wake 2 was in for an uphill fight before development even started, and while it would be easy for me to comment on how well it lives up to its predecessor, that would require me to answer the question of which one. And at the risk of giving away my own ending, the answer is no to both. Which does not mean it's a worse game than the ones that came before it, but it certainly is different. To even begin discussing Alan Wake 2, it's relatively necessary to take a look at its predecessor. Maybe not so much for what it was, but instead I think we'll get more context by looking at what it was supposed to be. By the way, I got a lot of my information from a fellow YouTuber called Indigo Gaming who has an amazing video on this subject, so if my light dusting of it has got you interested, check his stuff out as well. Right from the start, you could say Remedy was dead set on making a chapter-based narrative inspired by a fictional love affair between David Lynch and Stephen King, but how the player would experience that story was wildly different from its finished state. When development started, the team was aiming for a more open-world sandbox kind of environment, and it seemed like a majority of the tech and, most importantly, the effort behind that early Alan Wake build went into getting the game to smoothly render large open areas, making those areas feel dynamic with changes in weather and lighting, and either automating or randomizing those mechanics to whatever degree was physically possible at the time. I can still remember seeing very early teasers and trade show footage of the game and kind of being turned off from it. Even at its peak, I was never an open world kind of guy, and I wasn't sure even Remedy had what it took to get me over that hurdle. Looking at early interviews and opinions based on beta material, AW was originally meant to function something like a modern survival game, with Alan going out during the day to find things like gas to power generators that would keep the darkness at bay during the night. It was certainly an interesting idea for people other than me, which included Microsoft, who would buy in as a publisher after seeing a tech demo at E3 2005, and you could say that's when the proverbial tears started to show. Remedy at this point was already having a bit of a rough time merging the two opposing elements of their game together, the light versus dark narrative and the open world survival gameplay. And now they also had to deal with Microsoft popping in every so often with production goals or potential additions. In the end, 3 years had gone by and they were left with a lot of mechanics and systems, but no concrete video game to put them into. So, with not a lot of options left, Remedy broke things down to their most base elements and formed those pieces into something that better supported the story that they were looking to tell, which resulted in what was essentially a brand new video game existing within the confines of the open world systems and environments they had previously created. And I think it's that original open world form that perfectly leads into Alan Wake 2. Or at least it perfectly leads into a stepping stone to Alan Wake 2.
He is chasing a dangerous quarry, the Herald of Darkness.
In 2012, seemingly out of nowhere, Remedy would drop Alan Wake's American Nightmare, a digital-only side title that, on top of giving players a little more of a window into the first game's story and characters, also uses more of that original concept's open-world resources. The idea here being to make a wide open area for the player to explore and limit the use of new resources by looping gameplay elements. Yeah, that's going to come into play later. Now, to be fair, this game did not set the world on fire, and it wasn't exactly the best thing Remedy's ever made before, but for the purposes of this video, it's somewhere between these two games where we find our through line.
Fear of the dark is really just fear of what could be, that vast, paralyzing ocean.
Alright, so I will level with you guys. I have written and rewritten this part of the video several times now. And sure, some of that is due to my wildly unrealistic standards, but part of the blame rests with the fact that Alan Wake 2 is absolutely dripping with gameplay features to talk about. I mean, just off the top of my head, we have the shooting, the quasi-open world exploration, the detective mechanics, the return of the light and dark system, the upgrades, the profiling, the storyboarding, the lamp that can store light sources, or the environmental changes that brings, and the puzzle solving. My issue being, where the hell do I start?
It's a crazy jumble, like a nightmare.
It was something I really wrestled with for a while, but when watching my captured footage back, I noticed something. I'd gone back and forth with this for so long, but now the answer was just hitting me in the face like a beam from a concentrated flashlight. How do you start a script like this? The answer is obvious. At the beginning.
In a horror story, there are only victims and monsters. And the trick is not to end up as either.
Alan Wake 2's opening moment, despite not exactly looking the part, actually holds a lot of critical value for what we're going to see moving forward. As a first-time player, it's a creepy and atmospheric introduction to the narrative, but once you've had some time to chew on most of the core mechanics, you might see it as a perfect orientation for what's to come. Starting out, you take control of a bit of a familiar face. Agent Nightingale from the first game certainly got a raw deal in my opinion, and it really is nice to see him showing up, giving a bit of closure to his story arc, if you could call it that. After stumbling around disoriented, the once FBI investigator is shown to be hunted by a group wearing deer masks who not only want him dead, but want him dead in a very specific way. During that process, however, a few would-be hikers stumble on the scene and cut it short. And this is when we're introduced to the game's co-protagonist, FBI agent Saga Anderson. Her and her partner, Alex Casey, have been following a series of unsolved murders, the kind that appears to be tied to cult activity, making them pretty well equipped to investigate the murder we saw at the start. But what's more interesting than what they're doing here is what they're not doing here. Rather than turning the forest of Bright Falls into a shooting gallery of Taken for a second time, your first task after donning that blue FBI windbreaker is just talking to people, gathering clues and getting the scoop on what went down here. Now let's compare that with Quantum Break, Max Payne's 1 and 2, and the first Alan Wake game. With every single one of those titles, there's typically a gun in your hand and you're needing to fire it at someone within the first few moments of actually getting control of your character. By comparison, you could spend the first hour or even more of AW2 having never even drawn your weapon. In fact, before you're even shown how to fire your gun, you're taken to the game's first new gameplay implementation.
The Mind Place. My version of the Mind Palace technique.
The Mind Place, as she calls it, is a sort of metaphysical space inside of Saga's head that lets her visualize the collected elements of an investigation. The two main interactions here are the case board and the profiling area. On the case board, you can sift all of your information into relevant areas of the investigation, unlocking more clues as you go. With profiling, you can expectedly profile the people that you've met as long as they hold some kind of significance to the case. Now, it's important to mention here that I've stayed away from other content creators' videos on the game, so it is possible that I'm wrong about this, but I would imagine it's this starting gameplay reveal that filtered most Alan Wake fans, which has nothing to do with this mechanic's quality or how well it was implemented. It's just that this is the first time of many where the game tells you almost out loud that if you came into this sequel to Alan Wake expecting gameplay reminiscent of Alan Wake, well, in terms of feast or famine, let's just say you're about to get a lot more noticeable of a six-pack. And we are going to dive much further into that subject, but moving closer to the murder site, we're given a lot of exposition in the form of casual conversation between our two federal agents. Through these small interactions, we get an idea for how close these two are as partners, that each of them has a family, and that Saga here is a bit of a phenom at solving mysteries.
You're a better detective than I am. You've cracked cases that had the rest of us baffled.
Using a combination of good detective work and the mind place, we figure out that this was clearly some kind of a ritualistic killing and that the hikers showing up caused it to remain unfinished. A piece of information that seems important up until they come across a manuscript page detailing every bit of this case up to that point, including the two FBI agents' every action. Somehow deducing that there might be another page inside of Agent Nightingale, they have his body transported to the local morgue. Wanting to debrief the town's new sheriff, Alex leaves Saga to look around and talk to witnesses, and there's really something to be said for Remedy letting you just fully check out this memorable location the second you first step foot out of your car. It's exactly how I remember it almost 13 years ago, which could either be an attempt at keeping things familiar or a commentary on small towns resisting change to the very end. Either way, it is appreciated. As she checks things out, Saga gets recognized by Rose from the first game. She starts talking to her as if Saga had lived in Bright Falls but hadn't been back in a long time, and mentions something about her daughter having died, something that Saga assures us is 100% false. And you know, this may seem weird if it wasn't Rose we're talking about. Being crazy is kind of her MO.
I understand. I know what you need. A muse to inspire you.
Oh, for Barry.
And besides, who has time to question the validity of their own existence when there's good TV to watch?
Did somebody call for a tour guide?
Starting out with Max Payne's 1 and 2, Remedy showcased a real love for including mixed media in their games as in-universe TV programming, and since then it's become a big part of their development identity. At first, it was just technical limitations that had the team digitizing actual pictures of the staff dressed up in place of in-game cutscenes, mostly because they had already decided to use those same pictures as face textures, and those were going to be a pain in the ass to animate in a believable way. But by the time they'd found themselves free from that specific limitation, they'd grown a bit of a soft spot for it. And as the years would go by, that soft spot would turn into a genuine obsession, and that plays itself out here as the blending of real video mixed with Alan Wake's in-game graphics, leaving everyone in the gaming scene with a single burning question on their mind. When the hell is Remedy gonna say fuck it and just release a full FMV title? In reality though, I didn't think I'd like this much at first. Just on its face, the idea of seeing CG and real imagery side by side in the same scene is a little problematic for me. I mean, the fact of the matter is, even as good as AW2 looks, it has not achieved the kind of fidelity that'd have me scratching my head as to which of these two elements is a video of a real person. Well, I guess they did pull that trick off one time.
Oh my god! Oh god, you shot me! Ah!
As the game went on though, I grew to really enjoy it. Admittedly, the transition was made a lot easier by Remedy making sure most of the mixed imagery included a lot of video effects and transparencies, which really helps to dull that initial, this looks wrong kind of feeling.
I brought you the heart, witch. Show me the terror.
Back at the morgue, it turns out Saga's intuition was indeed correct. Not only was there another manuscript page in Nightingale's chest, but the sheriff's been finding these things all over the place. He proceeds to show Saga his little collection, but before he can, the guy just vanishes into thin air, an event that would hold a lot more significance if it wasn't directly followed by this one.
Show me the clicker.
The twice formerly dead Agent Nightingale is now roaming around the morgue, just absolutely destroying anyone in his way until Saga comes up with the out-of-the-box, wild idea to shoot him with her firearm. Before that, though, there's this pretty terrifying sequence where you're unarmed and have to stay in the light where he can't see you until you get an opportunity to run for a weapon. After dropping her fellow FBI agent for his third and final time in the last 13 years, he disappears and we're greeted with the return of an Alan Wake staple, the episodic format. Back in the 2010s when the first game was released, you'd see this a lot, and to be honest, I never really cared for it. Really, now that I think about it, I'm not sure that I've ever met anyone who liked it either. It may have just been a stylistic thing, but at the time I found it insulting that game developers working on AAA titles thought I would need constant refreshers of the previous 20 minutes of gameplay. Looking back now, I find the practice kind of quaint in the same way I lovingly appreciate the PS1's affine texture warping. I will say though, the episode breaks here in Part 2 are handled much better than its predecessor. Instead of summarizing the last chapter's events for you like you're an infant, they just play a really nice song over a credits screen, allowing you to save and shooting you back into the story whenever you want. And admittedly, it is kinda nice having a breather in between chapters where I can go grab a drink or do whatever else it is I need to do.
They say God made us in his image. Just like us, he is an uncaring, cruel son of a bitch.
And since I'm not good enough at writing to masterfully transition from episodic gaming to a more real-life issue, moving forward there's something we're going to have to address. Remedy's original idea for Alan Wake 2's casting is not what they would ultimately end up with, and sadly this was not an issue of contract negotiations or scheduling conflicts. Before shooting or voice work began for the game, we would lose the voice of Alice, Brett Madden, and Lance Reddick, who not only appeared in Quantum Break, but was also slated to play Mr. Door. And in a heartbreaking but recent addition to this script, we also have to add the voice of Alex Casey and, more importantly, Max Payne to that list. James McCaffrey's absolutely iconic performance as Max Payne is undeniably impactful. The man's gravelly affectation and his impeccable delivery very well may be the best voice work I will ever hear in my life. It's genuinely devastating that he'll never get to reprise that role, but if there is any silver lining to this, it's that his performance as Casey here in Alan Wake 2 is essentially his last time as the character. He may have a different name here, but this is the Max that I know and love in every aspect other than that.
How far would he go to create a perfect work of art? Or would he be the next victim?
I certainly was not planning on having to talk about this, and to be completely honest with you, I'd like not to. The fact of the matter is, what I just blurted out here like last week's news was nothing short of a fucking tragedy. It's a subject matter that strikes at an already raw nerve for me, and the fact that Max Payne 2 essentially got me through my late teenage years adds a level of seriousness to that I just don't want to tackle at the moment. So let's go ahead and call this my obligatory mention, and we'll move on to something a little less realistically bleak.
Happy birthday, Max Payne.
Coming back from the chapter break, we're left with a bit of an inventory of the situation as it currently exists. Agents Casey and Saga enter Bright Falls on the trail of a growing number of killings tied to a cult, and the second they cross the town divide, another killing is committed in a very similar manner. Through a combination of crime scene investigation, witness testimony, and I guess psychic powers, we put together that a group called the Cult of the Tree are taking people out in seemingly random order. On top of that, we have their most recent victim, which complicates things because he's a long-missing FBI agent who was last seen with the similarly long-missing Alan Wake. While examining his body, one of Bright Falls' best and brightest is plucked out of reality, and our murder victim gets up and starts snapping necks. After Casey and Saga both agree that neither of them are crazy and these events have actually gone down, they confirm that the manuscript pages they keep finding are indeed laying out exactly what will happen and whom it'll happen to. At this point, Saga retreats to the innermost reaches of her psyche to put all these disparate pieces together, and I'd say this is a perfect time to talk to you guys about what I consider to be the most simultaneously exciting and mishandled feature in the game. I've already introduced the Mind Place and its gameplay function, but what I didn't tell you is that it would grow to become one of my worst issues with Alan Wake 2, mostly because of how engaging I think the idea could have been. At first, the game will give you little hints that lets you know you may want to head to the Mind Place in order to move forward, but eventually you'll figure out that most progress-stopping hurdles you run into can be solved by spending a little time organizing clues and profiling people involved in the case. And in theory at least, this is an awesome mechanic. It reminds me of the similarly cool investigation sequences in Condemned Criminal Origins. In a perfect world, this would have players collecting clues and talking to people so they could get every bit of info available and then taking the time required to put all that together into something reasonable. In reality, however, it works like this. You listen to a bit of dialogue, maybe watch a cutscene, collect a manuscript page, or collect an item, and then you go into the mind place and play a game of Match the Shapes, where you put obvious story revelations that anyone with a room temperature IQ would have gleaned from the game by this point and place them all individually in a typically painfully obvious section of the case files. This also means watching quote-unquote profiling cutscenes where Saga, instead of coming to logical assumptions about a person using federal training, she has a weird psychic connection with them where every question she asked is answered by some kind of astral projected silhouette of them. My issue here is that these two features, instead of spurring on small bits of emerging gameplay where the player could intuitively figure out aspects of the case and be rewarded for it, end up playing out more like tedium-driven checkbox simulators. The game isn't using these tools to help me better understand the story, but instead as a bit of a pop quiz that gates event progress until I can pass it. My input's being required to complete a task that can take up a bunch of time, but I'm never being challenged while doing it, so it ends up feeling like busy work. Now, I'm definitely no game designer, but it feels to me like this could have worked much better if there was a way for the player to opt out of it. Then someone who was lost could look at all this and put things together, but the rest of us who are allowed to operate scissors that aren't rounded at the end can just continue with the game without the requirement of designated player-driven exposition dumps. The way these features were originally introduced had me really excited for their potential use in the gameplay loop, but aside from not living up to the concept of being able to actually investigate the game's narrative, they take unnecessary steps that block the flow of that narrative unveiling itself. Well, after engaging with the aforementioned tedious mind place checklist, we determined the best course of action would be returning to Nightingale's murder site, and this is when the game really opens itself up to you, which is where we get hit by something that could just barely be glanced during the intro. But talking about it is going to require a bit of a history lesson. Like we already covered, the original idea for Alan Wake 1 was to take place in an open world, one where things like weather and the time of day could be altered dynamically. Looking at making-of documentaries and pre-release media, it seems clear that most of the effort during development was poured into this specific format, but behind the scenes, Remedy was having one hell of a time getting all of this working and packaging it with a playable video game. So instead of having their first post-Max Payne release fall into a cycle of further and further receding launch dates, they made the decision to retool the open-world assets and systems they had already designed and make them work in the context of a more traditionally linear, story-driven experience. An idea that, looking back, I think was for the best. At the time, the open-world craze was a huge trend in game design, but I'm not sure that Remedy could have made that kind of a system work. Or at least I don't think they could have made a better game than the version of Alan Wake we actually ended up with using their initial concept. But in a very cool example of a developer taking revenge on their previous limitations, Alan Wake 2 gives players a taste of that original open world concept. Well, maybe not open world per se, but these are definitely much larger, more open environments than the previous game, and players are given a great incentive to explore them. This first area in Cauldron Lake gives you access to a wide layout, and if you're keeping an eye out for branching paths, you can find some really cool stuff. Things like extra ammo, batteries, added lore, upgrade points for your weapons, and little rituals you can perform with Saga to earn these wearable accessories that can change up things in combat. Of course, all of those pre-release ideas haven't been resurrected here in the sequel, but you can see a very clear attempt at marrying Alan Wake's initial plan form with the one that it would eventually take when it made it to the public. Now, with the privilege of the added 2020 vision of hindsight, we can critique the exact proportions of that mixture, but the fact that Remedy is interested in both righting a developmental wrong as they see it and making sure that fans get something that feels accurate to the first game is really nice to see. I can't even count the number of franchises, both movie and game, that fumbled the concept of the director's vision versus the consumer's expectations, but if anyone was going to pull off something like this, it was bound to be Remedy. But if I'm going to be fair, I should probably mention that running around these huge areas can be annoying after you've done it a few times, and the randomly spawning enemies can stretch resources uncomfortably thin. I do, however, think this gets balanced somewhat by more and more of the map opening up with game progress. This gives you a nice incentive to go into these areas more, which can open up alternative side routes and shortcuts. Getting back to the actual events of the game, this second trip to Cauldron Lake is when the explorative arm of the gameplay loop comes more into focus. Your first time here, there were a few out-of-the-way spots to visit, but at this point, these places actually start giving out rewards. On the way back down to the murder site, we run into a guy named Ilmo, someone you should find kind of familiar, not just because it's Peter Franzen from Vikings, but also because he's a bit of a local celebrity.
And that's why, at Koskela Brothers Adventure Tours, we say, fuck the government.
This guy and his brother are sort of this town's backwoods entrepreneurs. They run tours, a coffee shop, a brewery, an amusement park, and a local MC. Aside from playing a major character in the story, Ilmo here represents something kind of new for this company. In previous games, Remedy has been nowhere near shy in promoting Finnish artists and actors in their work, but Alan Wake 2 is less of a video game and more of a celebration of Finnish heritage. Bright Falls, in this iteration of the story, is shown to have a pretty substantial Finnish population. There's a lot centered around their cultural practices, and this ties into the main story in ways we're not going to get into just yet. And while it is wholesome to see these guys giving a shout out to their homeland, I gotta say, I don't think it exactly fits into the story in a very organic way. This may have just been me, but I was having a hard time suspending my disbelief with all of this, and I'll go as far as to say it felt kind of forced. I'm not gonna say it did any kind of irreparable damage to the story, but there was at least a take me out of it kind of effect every once in a while.
Must not drink the water or take a bath ever again.
Getting back to our conversation with Ilmo, we can see that the FBC, an organization from Remedy's previous release Control, exists here in this world, which lets fans of the company know that Alan Wake 2 is indeed a part of the larger connected Remedyverse. In previous games, this would essentially extend to in-universe callbacks to TV shows or bands that exist across all the properties, but now we're seeing story elements and characters from one franchise show up in another, and I've got nothing negative to say about that. I do wish that same courtesy would have been extended to Quantum Break, but we're going to have to get into that conversation on another day.
Memory problems again, huh?
Through a little exploration, Saga finds another page of Wake's new manuscript laying out a sort of ritual that needs to be completed for her to be able to follow Nightingale into a place called the Overlap, a kind of middle ground between our world and the dark place where Wake has been trapped all these years. And while we did get a short taste of it when Nightingale woke up, this is when we finally get to engage in some genuine combat. Just like you might imagine if you played the first game, here enemies have to have their shadows burned away by a light source before you can do any damage to them, and their attacks can be dodged with the timely press of a button. This time around, they don't use the same button for dashing and dodging, so the two functions don't have to share animations anymore, which is actually really nice. New to Alan Wake 2, the Taken will now reveal a sort of weak spot when you get rid of their protective darkness. Shooting this area afterwards deals extra damage and causes a pain state. Sometimes this will end up on a Taken's chest or stomach, but sometimes it's on their back or some other out-of-the-way place, meaning you might have to pull off a successful dodge or get very good at fast aiming before you can actually take advantage of them. After the disorientation of your first few fights, as you begin falling into a groove with the game's combat, it'll seem clear that they were going for a less arcade-adjacent, more Resident Evil 2 remake kind of system this time. And I think the best example of that is how they changed the dodge mechanic. In the first game, dodges were relatively easy to pull off, came with a sizable helping of iframes, and played a flashy animation on execution. By comparison, dodging in Alan Wake 2 requires a lot of precision, and it takes a frame-perfect dodge to get the whole slow motion thing to happen. And I'm being completely honest here, this was such a rare occurrence in both of my playthroughs, I'm genuinely not sure I'll be able to find footage of it as an example to show you guys. Like I said before, it's a very believable realness over arcadey action kind of approach, and we'll talk about whether or not that worked a little later. Putting together all the requisites for the ritual, Saga breaks into the Overlap where she comes across Nightingale, and after a nice little dust-up, she's able to put him out of his 13-year misery for the second time today. Shortly after this, she's able to communicate with the missing Alan Wake for a brief time. It's not exactly a strong connection, and it doesn't last very long, but that's okay because it seems like whatever she did in the Overlap caused him to be able to cross back over.
Are you okay?
No! It's my fault! It got out My face! Scratch!
During an impromptu debriefing, Wake lets Saga and Casey know that he's been stuck in the dark place, and they let him know that it's been 13 years.
13 years. Fuck me.
He's still messed up from crossing back over into this world, so his memory's a bit spotty and he's having problems figuring out exactly how he did it. What he does know is that Scratch, the sort of earthly embodiment of the dark presence taking the form of Alan, which was introduced in American Nightmare, is after him, and it won't be long till he finds him. As he talks, things start to come back to him, leading to this trippy flashback of his time in the dark place, which takes the form of a 1960s-esque late-night talk show hosted by someone named Mr. Dorr. Our host keeps asking questions about Wake's new book, with the only issue being he doesn't really remember writing one. Those of you with keen eyes may have realized that this scene is playing out as an FMV, which harkens back to one of Remedy's more experimental titles, Quantum Break. In that game, these sections were separate from the game's main narrative and sort of existed in between chapters. However, I would say it's used to a much better effect here by having the FMV exist alongside the normal in-game cutscenes. Because of this, Alan Wake 2 feels more like a whole piece of media as opposed to the amalgamation of TV show and video game that Quantum Break was. As the talk show facade starts to fade, we're introduced to another portion of the gameplay model. Essentially, you spend half of this game controlling Saga's investigation in Bright Falls, while the other half is spent with Wake in the Dark Places version of New York. Here things tend to take on a less combat-heavy and more puzzle and exploration-driven kind of approach. This version of New York seems to be built around a strong foundation of dream logic, so the layout can shift around and things can often be distorted if you're trying to keep track of where you're going based on where you've been. When navigating the dark place, we have access to the writer's room, which functions basically the same as Saga's mind place. Here, Wake can put together story concepts and plot twists to change aspects of the world, and it's actually a great little system. Unlike Saga's caseboard, this doesn't feel like busy work. Some areas are going to require you to really pay attention to details, and you might need to swap between several versions of the same scene to find out how you need to proceed. In short, they are very, very well-made environmental puzzles. And sure, you may argue that these only work because the dark place is essentially a giant puzzle box that warps reality, but I feel like something like this could have been worked into the real-world segments without too much tinkering. Heading down to the basement of the talk show building, we come across the lamp that used to be connected to the clicker from the first game. This brings on even more puzzle elements because it can store light charges, I guess, for lack of a better word. These can be transplanted into another potential light source, which will alter the landscape. This mixed with the storyboard mechanic makes for a lot of potential combinations, and I found this to be an amazingly satisfying experience. It's really engaging walking into an area and trying to take note of what story elements can be changed and where the lights can be swapped so you can proceed. Using his new tools, Alan makes it out of the studio and onto the city streets. Like I said before, here in the dark place, progress is made in a very dream logic kind of way. You receive tips from random payphone callers, and the layouts of buildings don't exactly follow reason. While exploring, you can come across crowds of these shadows, who are just silhouettes or some kind of concentrated negative emotions that'll dissipate when you shine your lights at them. 1 out of every 100, though, can manifest themselves and do actual physical damage to you, meaning you're never really able to relax. As far as I've been able to find, there's no real concrete way to figure out which one is which, so the threat, while relatively low, is always there in the background, which adds a great bit of tension to what would otherwise be just a puzzle section. And I think we're far enough into this video that we should probably talk about Alan Wake 2's presentation. Since the very start, Remedy's been known for making games that push the technical envelope in some kind of fashion, and that trend damn sure hasn't stopped with this game. The lighting here is just absolutely unreal in most scenes, and there seems to be a real effort to keep light rays looking natural. As time passes, you'll get to see familiar areas at differing times of the day, and each time it results in an almost completely different location. Everywhere you look, you can see light cascading across textures in the environment and overall just behaving in a very realistic way. It's some of the most advanced lighting tech I've seen in video games before, and it is exactly as impressive as that sounds. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you have a focus on colored lighting, the kind that realistically recreates the look of set lights on a stage. You see this effect a lot in either the overlap or the dark place, and it's almost better looking than the realistic stuff, at least artistically speaking. This type of style makes Alan's dreamier portions of the game fit the theme perfectly. Both sides of the coin here are returning some of the best looking results you can find, and with the full cast being modeled after real people, you'll be happy to know that it spends most of its time on the more positive end of the uncanny valley. Not every NPC is able to escape that android wearing a human face kind of look, but for the most part, things are great here. Honestly though, none of this should be surprising. Remedy has always been known for making good-looking video games the same way I've always been known for a spotty upload schedule. So instead of collectively agreeing that this looks mouth-wateringly good for another few minutes, let's get some complaints in.
Shit! Spilled my coffee.
And the first one that comes to mind is a beef I've had with AAA game developers for the last few years. That being, I probably should not have to drop your game below native 4K and medium settings just to hit a solid 60 frames per second on one of the fastest GPUs on planet Earth right now. I was eventually able to find a nice 70 to 80 FPS average by dropping settings way closer to medium than I would like and turning on DLSS for a 1440p native image upscaled to 4K. Like most games nowadays, Alan Wake 2 offers ray tracing, and just like those other games, RTX here offers a halved frame rate and really not a lot else. For reference, this is the game running at max settings at native 4K, right next to a combination of low to medium settings, DLSS, and ray tracing set to its medium preset. And for sure, if you spend a good amount of time analyzing these two images, you may just be able to find something approaching a substantial difference, but it's not going to be one I'd be comfortable throwing away 30 FPS for. I mean, if anything, the RTX side looks a little darker, and that's about it. So I'll give you guys the same advice I've been giving for years. Do not ever engage RTX unless you're taking a single still screenshot, because otherwise you are nerfing your performance and you're going to have to turn down every other graphical setting just so that your lighting can look kind of sort of different in a way that most people would never be able to tell, and honestly you probably wouldn't either. Moving on to something I usually scream for in shooting games, Alan Wake 2 includes persistent damage decals on enemy models. I mean, maybe I'm crazy, but when I shoot a bad guy with a gun, I'd like some kind of visual indicator that I just relocated his insides to his outsides. And like I said, we do get that here, but for a lot of reasons, it ends up being more comical than impressive. Don't get me wrong, I like the concept of shots taking off little bits of clothing and skin, but in practice, it ends up looking like this. All it takes is a single shot from the revolver to rend every bit of flesh from a full arm, and I don't know, that's kind of more lame than just not having the effect at all. And the same goes for headshots. Hitting someone in the face blasts away all their skin, which is cool in theory, but sometimes their glasses are left behind, or even worse, your flashlight hits the effect and it just ends up looking kind of dumb. I could be wrong about this, but it does seem to me like they were really trying to replicate the kind of damage decals seen in RE2 Remake, but the landing was botched pretty hard. I will say though, it's just a stone's throw away from being really good. With just a few tweaks, I could see the system being really believable. As it is though, you'd probably be better off not paying too much attention to the Taken after you've downed them. And this last one, I can fully admit, is sort of my own personal thing that I can't exactly blame on Remedy. These guys did such an awesome job at creating this natural looking lighting system that I really felt like turning my flashlight on in some areas ruined the vibe. This might sound kind of dumb, but I would go long stretches not seeing too far in front of me just because I didn't want to mess up the cool visual ambiance of the area. I'm not exactly sure there's a genuine fix for this, but I think making environmental reflections from the flashlight a little less harsh, it could help a bit. But to be fair, this is a micro complaint, and potentially it's one that only exists inside my head. Getting back to Alan and his Shadow New York, the author comes across a character from one of his hard-boiled detective novels, which I'm just now realizing I neglected to mention, but Saga's partner actually shares a name with this fictional character, Alex Casey. Outside of that though, the fictional Alex Casey is here in the Dark Place playing out some kind of an unreleased plotline regarding cult killings. As Wake continues to explore noir New York, he comes across Sheriff Breaker.
Oh, hey Alan. You snuck up on me.
Since he was snatched out of reality by the dark presence, he's been stuck wandering this place as well, and it seems like this is a bit of a cycle for Wake. As Breaker reveals, this is not the first time they've met, and him losing his memory like this is far from an uncommon event. He also says that he's on a bit of his own crusade to map this world out to whatever degree that's possible, and that he wants to find out who Mr. Door is. As you play through these Dark Place segments, you're going to come across what are ultimately unimportant stories taken from Wake's novels, but what is important is that you follow the reoccurring cult that seems to be committing gruesome acts under the belief they're being told to through Alan's writing. And listen, I might be a little dense, but I really had a hard time figuring out whether or not the cult of the word was something that existed in real life or just a narrative element for this book Wake has written. That's sort of a hard question to answer because once it is written, it becomes real life, but I guess what I'm asking is this something that existed before that Scratch was taking advantage of, or just a made-up story to allow Wake to manipulate the Dark Place? And since we're on the subject, is Rose actually getting messages from Alan in his books, or has she really just lost it? Anyways, getting back to the actual game, progressing through a subway system, Wake comes across Nightingale's dead body, and this is where we get to see his side of the previous conversation with Saga. Making his way to the building where he and his wife used to live, Wake gets to see that Alice has made quite a name for herself as a photographer since his disappearance. And that's all well and good, but about 6 years ago, things took a turn for the worst when Alice started hearing things at night. It started off simple enough, with things like typewriter keys getting hit and voices speaking, but from there things progressed to a full-on violent haunting. The biggest bomb being that it's Scratch who's been visiting her at night, and Alice's famous photography career came from snapping pics of him. And I gotta say, the new actress for Alice really kills these scenes. She looks believably at her wit's end, and Alan finding out that all of this has been going on since he's been away is pretty powerful. Following that trauma down a little deeper, we find out that everything that's happened so far has been the events of Wake's new novel Return. You know, the one that he can't remember writing. And to make things worse, it seems like that story is looped in on itself. Okay, this is going to be kind of hard to explain. So, not only is Alan the guy who wrote this story, but now he himself as a character in that story that he wrote is coming across the writing room where the story was written. Only no one's actually doing that because the version of him that was writing it is sitting there with a bullet hole in his head, which is only like the 9th most confusing thing we've come across so far. After this realization, we're taken back to the Bright Falls reality to find Saga and Casey knee-deep in trying to get answers out of the newly returned Wake. Since they found pages detailing nearly their every action, it stands to reason that they're in Bright Falls because of him, and that ends up being true. Because Saga was able to reach out and talk to Wake before, she essentially inspired him to use her and her partner as pawns, for lack of a better word, to facilitate him getting out. And once again, this might be confusing, but keep in mind that A, time works differently in the Dark Place, and B, there might be a little timeline jumping going on. Essentially, Saga being in Bright Falls retroactively informed Alan that he should write her into the story, which brought her to Bright Falls in the first place. I think I may have made it more confusing somehow. Anyways, the real takeaway here is that now they're in the story, it means Scratch is able to affect them and, more importantly, their loved ones. Without really thinking of the consequences, Wake has tied these two innocent FBI agents up in his story, and now they're at the whims of both him and his alter ego, which is made even worse because Saga's husband and daughter were also included in that story, explaining why everybody thinks that her daughter drowned. So they put their heads together to form a plan, and it seems like the clicker from part 1 is still their best bet. The goal here is to have Alan write some edits into the manuscript that would allow them to defeat the Dark Presence, and to do that, they'll need the aforementioned clicker to bring those changes into reality. The only problem being, everyone's pretty sure that if Wake got out, so did Scratch, which means this just became a much more dangerous and unpredictable scenario. At this point, you're given access to another one of the game's nearly infinite mechanics. The ability to switch between Saga in the real world making moves to facilitate the new story, and Alan in the Dark Place searching for answers that he's forgotten since crossing over. And normally, I'd say this is a pretty nice feature to have. It gives players control over when they do and don't want to mess around in the Dark Place, so you could start completing goals as Saga and only check in with Alan every once in a while, or vice versa if you wanted to. And it would be nice if that was the case, but instead it feels like this is one of the better examples of the game crumbling under its own creative weight. It's almost like Remedy wasn't really sure how to marry these two ideas in the same game, so each one is given its own metagame. With Saga, you get more combat and exploration, and with Alan, you're going to be doing more puzzle solving and thinking in dream logic. And before you start getting irrationally pissed, these are both really fun styles of gameplay. I enjoyed both approaches at different points, and it was really nice being able to switch between the two when I wanted. But I still can't shake the feeling that they didn't need to be two separate, distinct units like this. Why not allow Alan to engage in more combat and for Saga to do more environmental puzzle solving? I mean, sure, I'm fine with switching between the two at certain points, but it would have been nice if I could have all of these avenues available to me no matter who I was playing. I really enjoyed both of these two as characters, and the simple difference between their loadouts or maybe their abilities would have made switching between them just as enticing. As it stands, it's not like we're looking at a failed game mechanic or anything, it's just a portion of the final product that I feel like could have worked better.
Fuck this place.
Anyways, after watching some very necessary TV, Saga makes her way for the adjacent town called Watery, the home of the world-famous Koskela brothers. While asking around, Saga's hit with even more people that think she's from this place. People saying they remember her and that they're sorry for the death of her daughter, which, if you're going by what they say, is the reason why she left the town. Since the game started, we've been coming up against sporadic mentions of this fake history. Now, Saga, knowing her own life and being aware that Wake and Scratch's story is likely affecting reality, starts off confident. She's pretty sure that these people are just confused or being used like pawns to get the story across, but after a while she starts questioning things, and to be honest, so did I. And those questions get a little harder to answer when we start uncovering real concrete connections between her and the two lovable rockers from the first game, Tor and Odin.
Excuse me.
While searching around the Watery area, Saga's going to come across more Taken, and now that we've had a good chunk of time to ruminate on this game's combat, it's time I drop a bomb on you. I kind of don't like it. Now, to be fair, I was sort of expecting the kind of combat you could find in the first game, but to be fair to me, that's not exactly an unreasonable expectation for a sequel. But to explain this, we're going to have to get a little technical, so if you don't mind, let's go off on a tangent. In the first Alan Wake, firing weapons had a massive amount of power to it. From the feedback and the sound effects of the shots going off to the satisfying popping noise that came from your bullets smashing into the Taken, nearly every aspect of firing a weapon in that game just felt boomy and impactful. You could definitely say that movement was a little loose, but it was fast enough that you could move in and out of your enemy's range with ease, and then you had the dodge mechanic that would activate this sick-ass slow-mo animation showing you masterfully ducking out of the way of an axe swing. By comparison, Alan Wake 2 keeps its camera tight on the player's back, and movement is much more stilted. With the closer field of view and less mobility, you won't be fighting too many bad guys at once, which is a good thing because the Taken here are much more lethal than the ones we encountered before. Their jerky movements can make accurate shooting kinda hard, and it takes way more ammo to put them into a pain state than it used to. Along with that, they nerfed the absolute hell out of the dodge, and the guns just don't have as much power behind them in terms of raw feeling. Whether or not it's a good thing, no matter how you look at it, the combat here in Alan Wake 2 acts almost like a complete opposite to Alan Wake 1's. While playing that and American Nightmare, fights were fast and flashy, but here they're slow and weighty. It's kind of like going from Max Payne 2 to Gears of War. You might like both of them, but it's a little jarring. And in that same light, which is a hilarious transition, there's something really screwy going on with Alan Wake 2's Torch. In the first game, a boosted shot at a Taken would strip him of his invulnerability. It was a simple process, and it played into the combat in a really fluid way in my opinion. In part 2, however, I'm gonna be gracious and say it's unnecessarily frustrating. As opposed to the words that I was previously gonna use, dog shit. Instead of the light just doing damage to the shadow attached to an enemy like it used to, there are precise spots that need to be hit, and it feels like the cone of your flashlight when boosted is about the circumference of dental floss. And you know, I use this phrase a lot, most of the time in exaggeration, but I'm being dead serious when I say that I can't even count the number of times that I flashed a bad guy only to have him move slightly, making his shadow almost untouchable. Which of course forces me to use another 1 or 2 focus blasts before I could do any damage to them. It was wildly frustrating and completely unnecessary. It's actually kind of ironic that in my video on Alan Wake 1, I argued that the flashlight batteries were so plentiful that I didn't really understand why they needed to be limited in the first place. Why not just let me use my flashlight without draining any batteries, because I effectively had an infinite supply around me at all times. And to be fair, they did sort of listen. There are way less flashlight batteries to be found in Alan Wake 2, which is nice. It feels like a proper limited resource now. It just seems like a really odd move to do that and then increase the player's need for batteries. Either of these fixes individually would have served as a great fix for what I saw to be a kind of slightly annoying problem in the first game, but using both of them here just has them pulling against each other. One of them just cancels the other one out and we're left with the same problem, just on the opposite end of the spectrum. Instead of having a never-ending supply of batteries at my fingertips, I was in constant need of them, and it wasn't because they were more limited, it's because they're more limited and I can almost never hit the weak spot on a take-in on the first shot. But even without taking into consideration the really crappy flashlight boost, I just never felt proficient with Part 2's combat. In the first game, I'd still get my ass kicked every once in a while, but I could also reliably pull off some really cool stuff. In Alan Wake 2, no matter what happens, I always feel like I just barely made my way through a fight. Kind of like when you win a fighting game against someone who's way better than you, but if they asked, you'd never be able to tell them how you did it. I certainly wouldn't go so far as to say it's a bad combat system, but it is one I don't like as much as the game that came before it. That being said, if you're coming in with zero context, I'd imagine most of these issues won't bother you much at all, but if you already know how good the combat was in the first game, jumping into this one might be a bit of a shock. As Saga continues exploring, she ends up back in the overlap, where she gets another chance to talk to past Alan in the dark place, trying to get some clarification on the parts of the story that current Alan can't remember. In the process, she also gets a hold of the clicker, which means she has exactly what she needs to put a stop to all this, but if you're looking at the amount of runtime left in this video, you can probably figure out things don't go down like that. On her way back to Bright Falls, Saga tries getting in touch with her husband and daughter but can't get through, which is a pretty harrowing situation to be in for someone who just found out those people could be written out of history if Scratch's story becomes reality. But we're going to go ahead and put a pin in that and switch back over to Alan's adventures in Darktown.
But I like to call this next segment the story of the journey of Alan Wake, the musical.
Alright, so if you happen to have logged into Twitter at any point past this game's launch, you've probably seen videos and images of this part, and it's for a good reason. It's a really visually effective sequence, and the song is just an all-time banger.
Well, yes, I think it's true and fair to say.
I really liked how the environment was set up to look like an actual stage show, and it was at this point that I realized I was playing a passion project. Without a doubt, this is a scene that you come up with when you're really enjoying the process of creating something interesting, as opposed to lining up a series of Skinner boxes that are statistically guaranteed to test well with all audiences. And if you were wondering, this is what I meant in the intro when I said this is Remedy operating at peak Remedy. Over the years, we've caught glimpses of their outside-the-box thinking, but I think this is them operating with just zero restraint. With the sheer density of varying mechanics you can find in this game, my initial reaction was that Remedy might be hedging their bets, including multiple gameplay elements so that everyone would be happy, but now it looks more to me like this is just a bunch of stuff they've been wanting to put in a video game forever and finally they have a chance to, so it's all going in. Of course, not everyone's going to enjoy everything they put in, music video rock opera level very much included, but even when it's something that doesn't necessarily land, it's just great seeing a developer with enough balls to really go for it. As you make your way through the rock opera dimension, it becomes very clear that this is all the work of Wake's ego. These TV appearances, the musicals, and the rabid fans, they're all just stuff that at least a part of Wake wants as a writer. Although I'd imagine baser desires like that would rank pretty low on his list of priorities after he's been left in a nightmare dimension for 13 years, but hey, that's the human ego for you. At the same time, or I guess rather in the future, we're taken to Agent Casey in Wake. Casey talks about how much he hates that one of the writer's most famous characters is named after him. And I'm gonna level with you guys, as a guy named Jared who used to work at Subway, I get where he's coming from. Anyways, Wake fills us in that he can't exactly create something out of nothing in the dark place, so he had to use Casey's career and parts of his life to inspire the creation of the character. Which, I don't know about you guys, but that clears a few things up for me because for a good portion of the game's runtime, I kind of assumed Casey wasn't real. As their conversation gets underway, members of the Cult of the Tree flood in, saying that they're after Wake, but as the attack starts, he doubles over in pain, telling Casey to watch out because it feels like Scratch is near. Eventually, Wake passes out, and when he comes to, he's surrounded by and covered in the guts of the people that came to kill him. For some reason, that doesn't really register with him, and he goes after Casey, but he starts to feel Scratch's presence and proceeds to pass out again. Which is probably a nice place to let you guys know we are about to enter spoiler territory. I know we've already been into most of the story by now, but as we go on from here, everything we talk about is going to mess up some kind of late game reveal. So if you haven't played the game yet, do me and you a favor and skip to the timestamp on screen or use the chapters to skip past this point. For everybody else, we're going to go ahead and blaze forward. Alright, let's do it.
You think you know. You know shit. You don't really want to know.
So as Alan struggles with his little consciousness issue, a lone cultist takes his shot, but unfortunately for him, so does Saga. In the process of shooting the knife out of his hand, we find out that it's actually Ilmo, but before we can process that, the place is descended upon by G-Men. They tell Saga that she's no longer on this case and that everything's been transferred to the Federal Bureau of Control, the SCP tier organization from Remedy's previous game, Control. Now, I'll go ahead and admit right here that I've only played maybe an hour of that game by this point, so I'm not exactly well informed, but based on what's revealed here and a little internet osmosis, the FBC is a group put together to track, study, and eliminate any supernatural or extra-dimensional threats to the country. It's kind of like the X-Files, except everyone's taking orders from Mulder instead of openly talking shit about him to his face. Saga being understandably pissed that all of her hard work just got co-opted by a mysterious government organization represented by an acronym other than the one that she works for, decides not to let them know that she has the clicker in her possession. And this is where I've got to admit that I don't exactly like at least a small portion of this story. Earlier in the video, I hinted at a connection between Tor, Odin, and Saga, and that's where my issue lies. I'm 100% fine with them adding a new protagonist into the Alan Wake lore, and I even really like Saga's personality. She can kick ass and take charge, but doesn't deny herself the simple pleasures like petting every deer head mounted to a wall in the Tri-County area. No, my problem is that Remedy, for some reason, thought she needed to be blood-related to side characters from the first game. I mean, maybe there's a crucial bit of lore that I'm missing or something, but I just don't see a point to her having amnesia about being related to a couple of aging metalheads. I mean, honestly, imagine being raised around these two and then totally forgetting about it.
We are family! The Andersons! Vikings! Gods!
For me at least, it didn't serve the story as an aha moment, but instead it had me scratching my head as to why they thought that was a good idea. A part of me thinks that this is to explain Saga's mind place, but couldn't she just be a really good detective? I don't think she needs a familial tether to the story. Her stakes were already raised well enough when it turned out Alan writing her into the story ended up putting her husband and daughter in jeopardy. She's already stuck here and she can't leave until this thing's unraveled. This revelation about her having a blood connection to all of this in the most convenient plot sense possible, in my opinion, only serves to undermine all the work the writing crew did, weaving a really engaging story up to this point. Anyways, moving on, Saga pops in to visit her creepy uncles, but in the process finds out the retirement home they stay at has a bad case of, I can't think of a pun. There's taken there. It's been taken. When she gets there, Saga's greeted by Rose, who is as weird and conspicuous as ever, which makes it seem like she has knowledge of what's going on to some degree. Once we get in and get the scoop from the residents, we head up to Odin's room, but he's having some kind of a psychotic episode. So Saga heads to the mind place to get a handle on things, but in her proximity to Odin, she finds out the whole mind place thing goes both ways in the Anderson family. Odin lets her know that the two rockers can't fight the darkness the way that they used to, and Saga, being an Anderson, kinda has to pick up their slack. Saga asks if they're part of the cult, and while there was an attempt at recruitment, Tor and Odin kinda like being free agents in this conflict. He also tells her that the light switch is a sort of booster. The dark presence is able to turn art into reality, which is why Alan can write things into existence, but the light switch supercharges that effect and would be necessary to put everything back to how it was. So now Saga has to find Tor and make sure the darkness, working through Cindy Weaver, aka the Light Lady from Part 1, doesn't get a hold of him. Which is actually a nice little distraction because the FBC still has Wake at this point, and Saga can't really do much of anything to save her daughter by herself. When she finally gets to him, Tor is already at least a little under Weaver's control, and she has him go through an opening into the overlap, which means we've got to put together another ritual to go in there after him. And I gotta say, this iteration of Rose has really grown on me. She's somehow secretly getting messages from Alan in his writing telling her how to prepare for what's to come, but she's also trying to put on an act to keep people from figuring out that she's involved. And in the process, she gives off this heavy mom energy. I really love it.
Cynthia Weaver, I know it's you. This kind of behavior is not okay.
To be honest though, I don't think I ever got any clarification on whether or not this is something that's actually happening or if it's just Rose's pre-existing issue with being a psychotic Wake fangirl. I mean, Alan does deny he's given her any orders, but that guy's forgotten most of the game's plot by this point, so who knows. Anyways, Saga lets Rose know that they're both working to save Wake, and she finally opens up and lets her in on how much she knows. Gathering the requisite items, Saga crosses over into the overlap again and takes on Cynthia Weaver, saving her grandfather. Afterwards, she has another conversation with a version of Wake that is yet to meet her, which is what's been driving his including her in this story. Although that does create a bit of circular logic, as Alan would have needed to have met Saga in order to put her in his story, and she already needs to have been in his story for him to have met her. Yeah, go ahead and wrap your head around that one. Well, now that Odin's safe, we get a little more of an explanation on Saga's lineage. Apparently, the Andersons are relatively outside the influence of the Dark Presence's reality-shifting powers. They're able to see the real world even when everyone around them is seeing the horror story, which is why I assume Saga's daughter is probably safe. He also lets Saga know that he was sort of an asshole to her mother, which is what caused her to take Saga and leave when she was a baby. And once again, I have to say, I fail to see the necessity for something like this. In a plot concerning an ancient evil power that can shape reality based on fiction, this stands out as being particularly sort of fictional. Anyways, once we're done with the family get-together, Saga decides to head back to Bright Falls and finally let the FBC in on the rest of what she knows. And on a completely unrelated note, this part of the game for some reason glitched into constantly playing a rain sound effect despite no rain being visible and no running water being anywhere near me. Even when I got back to Bright Falls, it sounded like I was being followed by a monsoon. Moving back over to Alan Wake's adventures in Noir York, our author finds the manuscript to the novel he can't remember writing, which causes a bit of a time paradox because this is technically the point when Alan adds Saga to the story. Now, it's important to point out that he doesn't have full control here because the story already exists and trashing it won't do anything to its effect on reality. So instead, Wake decides to edit it, work within the margins of what Scratch made and try to squeeze something good out of it. Only he's stopped before he can finish and is forced to start the loop all over again. Meeting back up with Mr. Door, Alan gets the closest thing to a straightforward conversation that we've seen for this entire game. Door lets Alan know that he's a part of a coalition of people trying to help him, not necessarily because he wants Alan to succeed, but because he dragged Saga into all this. He berates Wake and causes him to come face to face with the idea that in the process of trying to figure all of this out, he's gotten countless people killed and roped innocents into his game just so he can get out of the dark place. He's having to come face to face with the fact that he has unknowingly been incredibly self-centered, using real people as characters in his book and upending their lives just so he can get what he wants. It's honestly a really cool angle for everything that's been going down. And I gotta say, I also really like how they're setting up Mr. Door to be this big player in the dark place. Kinda like he's a force that Alan might not want to mess with.
The next time we meet, the circumstances will be very different. And you would do well to return the favor by playing your part. Or stay out of my way, Mr. Wake.
Looking for more answers, Wake heads over to talk with Thomas Zane, a character from Part 1 and the previous creative type who was locked up in the dark place against his will. Apparently, Alan's come to him before in a previous loop. At that point, he decided to stop writing because of the effect it had on other people and that maybe he deserved to be where he is. And since Scratch needs someone to make some type of art to get him out of there, he came to Zane. The two of them wrote the novel Return together with the stated goal of both of them getting out, but at the final hour, Scratch left Zane there. After failing to appeal to Wake's conscience, Zane starts trying to shape reality with his art to get himself free, but Alan puts a stop to that in record time. And at this point, we figure out there are actually several versions of Alan running around different loops in this place, and some of them are trying to help out by giving him clues and outright telling him where to go next. Switching back over to Saga, we find the police precinct where the FBC has set up camp is in shambles. They are taken all over the place, and it looks like Agent Estevez, Wake, Casey, and the Koskela brothers are the only survivors. Heading down to talk with Casey, it seems like the horror story's finally gotten its hooks in him, which means he now believes the narrative that Saga's daughter is dead. After repairing the power, Estevez tells us there's not going to be any backup from the FBC, so we head down to talk with Wake, where we find Ilmo and Yako and discover that the Cult of the Tree isn't the nasty organization we thought it was. Turns out they actually know more than most about the situation and are pretty dedicated to keeping Scratch inside of Cauldron Lake. Saga confronts Wake about putting her kid in the story, and before we get an apology, it's revealed that we weren't dealing with a time travel plot, but instead a double agent one. This has been Scratch the entire time, which means Wake actually hasn't made it out of the dark place yet, and we've been dealing with a shadowy alter ego instead. After hitting him with some good old-fashioned fluorescent light, the team has a little time to consider what just happened and how they should deal with it. Ilmo's brother Yako was killed by Scratch when he manifested, which, if I'm being honest, hit me a little harder than I would have expected, and feeling like it was his fault, Ilmo comes clean to Saga. He tells her that the Cult of the Tree was formed because they knew what horrors lied in Cauldron Lake, and their goal was to kill anything that came out of it, which explains the sequence at the start of the game. So I guess knowledge of the power within the lake isn't as exclusive as we once thought, and it seems like the amount of Taken that have been coming out of the lake has greatly increased since Alan Wake came to Bright Falls to clear his writer's block. Which explains why the Cult of the Tree were so gung-ho about killing Wake before they even knew he was Scratch. Anyways, as of now, the situation as we know it is this. Scratch is free in the real world and needs the clicker to manifest his story further than the bounds of Watery or Bright Falls. And we've got 3 federal agents here in reality, along with 2 assets behind enemy lines in the dark place trying to stop him. So Saga comes up with a plan that requires them to go to Cauldron Lake, perform a ritual to open a door to the dark place, and use the clicker to attract Scratch so they can contain him, hopefully in the process allowing Wake to cross over and combining his manuscript with the clicker to end all of this. In order to enact this plan, Saga gets the old gods of Asgard back together for a massive brawl with a live heavy metal show backing it, which is an idea that's so damn beautiful it brings a tear to my eye. Speaking of tears, the plan doesn't exactly work out the way we would have wanted, so we're taken back to the dark place with Alan as he finds more videotape messages from his wife, ones that were genuinely kind of gut-wrenching to watch. All of this time, Scratch has been tormenting her, and as far as she knows it, it's been Alan. Eventually, this breaks her down to the point where she takes, well, let's call it the DIY way out. This was a really powerful scene for me. Alan laments that the final moments she might remember of him were of a guy that looks exactly like him torturing her. In a fit of rage and understandable hatred for Scratch, Wake storms into the writer's room, sees him, and blows his brains out, except that wasn't Scratch. It was Alan. I've been using the term loop a lot in this video, and this is the point where it has the most meaning. Even when Dor was talking to him, he mentioned how Wake would always sabotage himself before he can accomplish anything in the dark place, and now we're getting to see the actual physical manifestation of that taking place. Things here in the dark place work in such circular, multi-dimensional ways that if Wake one day decides to never write again, another iteration of himself will get that original version killed, or to put it better, just as one version of him is able to start editing Scratch's story, another version will storm in and dome him. It makes for this really amazing moment where Alan has to confront his own personality flaws as they pose a very real mortal danger to him and the people he cares about. Back at Cauldron Lake, Saga's trying to figure out why Wake didn't show up when it dawns on her that he sort of did. This ritual that they just performed is what caused him to manifest on the shores of that same lake near the start of the game, which I guess means the whole time travel plot thing is back on the table. So Saga uses some FBC tech to weaken him and tries to contain the guy in a special box, but Scratch seems to have no issues getting out, although it did require him to leave his host. And if he can leave one, it stands to reason.
Casey! Scratch!
So now the dark presence is inside of Casey and he's got the clicker. After throwing Saga in the hole that they just opened up to the dark place, he proceeds to use that clicker, which sets into motion the ending that he and Thomas Zane wrote for his story. Alan's goal, now that he's finally made it into the real world, is to try to get his hands on the manuscript so he can edit the ending into something that isn't apocalyptic. Now, for some reason that I'm totally and fully okay with telling you I don't really understand, this requires him to go back to the dark place, which is a decision he's well aware once cost him 13 years and recently the love of his life. Entering Scratch's ending, we find the world obsessed with the released version of Alan's return. As you walk around Bright Falls, you can hear everyone talking about it, and all of the radio and TV ads are praising it.
Wake set a high standard with his previous novels, but I can say without hesitation that Return contains the best and most compelling book description on a back cover that I have ever read.
Getting his hands on a copy of the book, Wake heads to the writer's room, which is, for some reason, now in the attic of the old folks' home, so we can rewrite these events into something less culty. And in a reunion I probably shouldn't have been so stoked over, Rose gets to finally fulfill her role as Alan's savior. At this point, I still couldn't tell you if Wake actually did send her secret instructions in his book, or if she really is just the right amount of crazy, but either way, God, I love her.
Oh, I get it. Yes, Alan, only a crazy person would think you've been leaving them secret messages. Wink.
Once he makes his way into the writer's room, Wake reiterates that the story's gotta be balanced. It has to follow the rules of writing, so he couldn't just jot down and everyone lived happily ever after and be done with it. There's gotta be a price to pay, and there needs to be someone there to pay it. From here, we're taken back to Saga, who, when crossing over into the dark place, somehow got stuck in her mind place. Except all of her case files are gone, and the only way for her to get out is to sit through the profiling and case board systems for way too damn long. In the process, she drops all of her self-doubt and reminds herself who and what she's fighting for, which is when she realizes that it was that doubt and fear that was preventing her from leaving the dark place. This gets her to the alternate New York that Wake inhabited during his time there. As she shows up, Saga gets a call from, I'm assuming Alice, letting her know that she has to take advantage of all the stuff Alan was doing throughout the course of the game, which is actually pretty cool. At first, the goals that Alan had in the dark place, like placing photos in a shoebox, felt kind of video gamey, kind of like they were grasping at missions to give the guy. But towards the end of the game, we find out that this was all a setup for these events to play out exactly like they're about to. Well, anyway, Saga makes it to the writer's room and meets Alan there. Through her mind place, they've been communicating on exactly how this has to go down, and the plan seems to be for Saga to use the clicker to alter the story, forcing Scratch out of Casey and back into Alan, where Saga will then blast the possessed writer in the headpiece, hopefully killing Scratch. And when it all goes down as planned, Wake's got a hole in his head, Casey seems to be okay, and Saga's trying to call her daughter to make sure they did things right. Then the credits start to roll, but just after that, we're treated to another VHS recording of Alice, letting us know that not only is she alive, but she's in the dark place. Her attempt to punch her own ticket was actually just her crossing over, although it had to look like that so that Alan had the fuel that he needed in order to break his loop. And at the very end, we see Alan jolting awake with a nice little setup for a potential sequel, but more of a nod to the first game's ending.
It's not a loop. It's a spiral.
Of course, I should mention that there is a more complete ending that you can view by playing through the game again in its final draft mode, which basically unlocks the last minute or so of the actual ending. In the new finale, instead of just teasing it, we get to hear Saga actually talk to her daughter, who is 100% alive, and as the phone call ends, Alan shoots up proclaiming that their efforts worked. Then there's a little more dialogue that may or may not be setting up some kind of a multiverse. To be totally honest, I'm not 100% that less than 30 seconds of new footage is enough to spend another 30 hours on a video game for, but I'd say it's a pretty good bit of free content, so you really can't complain too much. Speaking of which...
You are a character in my story!
Alright, we've spent the last, 17 pages of this script laying out the particulars, so where do I stand on all this? Well, I can tell you one thing from the very start. This is without a single doubt in my mind, the game that Remedy's been wanting to make for what seems like their entire existence. Let's call it the final form of their highly specific creative process. From the writing to the use of mixed media to even the cast they use to represent their characters, you can draw a straight line from just about every element here to a previous Remedy project. And you know, as a guy who's followed this company's output from nearly the beginning, playing this game felt like I was thumbing through an old photo album of theirs. Sort of like I was seeing the result of their entire catalog being squished into a single experience. It is without a doubt Remedy at their most Remedy. That being said, I've got a list of issues with this thing the length of my arm, the least damning of which being how hard it is to play for a second time. And I'm not saying that the initial twist and story beats were already ruined for me. No, instead I mean actually getting through the game a second time. I started up Alan Wake 2's final draft mode with the intention of grabbing footage of the new ending and including it here in this video. But those 3 or maybe 4 hours of gameplay were absolutely brutal for me. Huge amounts of time at the start are dedicated to walk and talk scenarios that either should have been cutscenes or shouldn't gate progress if you want to slip past them. In that same vein, there's no way to skip most dialogue here at the start, and keep in mind the start of this game lasts at least an hour, probably closer to 2. That's a lot of time to spend looking at the screen waiting for characters to stop talking so you can walk forward. Cutscenes are easy enough to rush through, but most dialogue for the first few hours takes place during actual gameplay. For example, let's say you've made it back to Bright Falls and you're interviewing the witnesses to Nightingale's murder. Not only can you not skip this sequence, but you can't even stand up and grab a drink letting it play out while you do some stuff around the house. You need to not only offer up prompts for Saga to respond to them, but you also have to profile them and use the caseboard following their clues. I'd say most of the dialogue in the game plays out like this, and listen, I really like this story, but not so much that I can sit through all of this again with no issues. And listen, to be very clear, this is not a complaint in the traditional sense. After all, I loved all of this stuff the first time around. I was eating this story up, but now that I know every single word these people are gonna say, sitting there and waiting for them to spit it out is kinda torture. Especially since it takes quite a few hours until you're able to engage in combat or have access to Alan's part of the campaign. And it seems like I'm not the only one who felt this way, because we did eventually get an update that lets you jump to any chapter you want. And as expected, being able to leap right into any part of the game you want is great, but you are still going to have to eventually sit through a lot of dialogue that you've already heard before. And I understand this is not a huge problem, especially for those of you that might be playing this for the first time, but I just wanted to start with the least annoying issue I had, especially since this next one is probably the most botched area of the game.
The light switch is like an amp. You can play rock and roll without it, but you won't blow anyone away.
Like I've already said, when I first interacted with the profiling and caseboard mechanics, I was absolutely stoked at the possibilities. The thought of having to go around collecting information and needing to put it together in a logical way gave me hard detective vibes. Very good vibes to be getting at the start of a game. But as I used it more, it started to turn into busy work. It seemed like after every cutscene, I would have to go into Saga's mind place so she could turn that cutscene into a series of keywords and pictures that I would then need to manually sift through, sorting by category so Saga could finally understand what that person just said. And the same thing goes for the profiling, but in the opposite direction. Unlike the name would suggest, you're not going to be coming to any informed conclusions based on a character's history or their personality traits. But instead, Saga gets to hear that character say plot points out loud that she could have never had knowledge of. And yes, I do get it, she's basically psychic. It's just a bad mechanic. It's not profiling, but instead a forced exposition dump that they filmed a bunch of live action sequences for. To me, it sort of feels like these were necessary because they couldn't figure out how to get Saga to organically come across this information. Here, imagine this. You're watching a murder mystery, and after like 45 minutes of evidence collecting and witness testimonies, the police just turn to a psychic who tells them exactly who did it and where they are in like 5 minutes. It's a little disappointing, right? Combine that with the case board system, and you've got several points per chapter where you're going to have to halt all story and exploration, just so Saga can play match the shaped blocks and get vital plot information that you put work into figuring out told to her psychically. And you know, it's way more frustrating because both of these are just a hair's width away from being so much better. If these systems would have been effectively implemented into the story and gameplay, maybe we could have had a game where the main character actually acts like an FBI agent. The point is that both of these could have been very innovative systems, but instead they got turned into unskippable pop quizzes on the last 20 minutes of progress, which is a lot of things, but I wouldn't say fun is one of them.
Would I be Hope? Or was this just an echo of the real thing?
But moving on to something a little less disappointing, I will say that there might have been a few too many mechanics included here. I mean, we've got the aforementioned caseboard and profiling, borderline useless weapon upgrades, stat buffing accessories, a limited inventory with item management, twin campaigns that can be switched between on the fly, the storyboard mechanic, which actually was well implemented and interesting, exploration of a really large environment that opens up as the game goes on, a massive amount of really cool puzzles, a few bad ones, and a whole bunch of dialogue choices that don't affect much of anything outside of my annoyance centers. And for sure, these are not all bad things to see in a video game. In fact, some of them are amazing. Like I said, I love the puzzles, and while having a limited inventory had no effect on my game until about hour 23, it's always nice to see. Being able to switch playable characters when you get tired of one campaign or upgrading your guns, great inclusions. It just feels like with all of these big ideas inside of it, even a game as long as Alan Wake 2 can't really give any of them the kind of attention they would need to stand out or do well. And hey, who knows? If they slim down the feature list a bit, maybe the combat would actually hold a candle to the first game. Now, judging by a general wind direction test on the internet, it seems like I might be in the minority here, but let's do this anyways.
We want the rider! No one else needs to get hurt! Fuck off!
Just for a quick second, let's have a look at an enemy encounter from near the end of Alan Wake 1. Did you notice how I had to stay very mobile, making sure to use my flashlight and the pain state it causes as crowd control while making sure my dodges were on point? Well, let's compare that to a relatively similar encounter from Part 2. Aside from some of the more flashy elements, which we will get into, notice how I can't fire without aiming now, which means anytime I want to attack, I limit my view of the Taken who have surrounded me. My movement speed's also severely decreased by comparison, making avoiding hits mostly reliant on the dodge button, which is harder to pull off here. When an enemy inevitably gets up close in a fight, not only am I forced to zoom in to ready my weapon, closing off my field of view even further than the already zoomed in camera, but my flashlight also has less of an effect on them, meaning I can no longer reliably use it to get them off of me. Overall, the combat here is much more slower paced and static than the first game. Of course, it really didn't help that a majority of my boosted flashlight beams did about as much damage to the Taken as a fart traveling on the breeze, thanks to hitboxes that are very finicky. Getting to those flashy bits I mentioned earlier, just listen to Alan plugging away at the Taken in Part 1. Did you notice how powerful and boomy that felt? The sound effects, the lighting, the slow motion on kill, It all makes for a combat system that has heft and feedback to it. Now here's Saga doing roughly the same thing. I think we can all agree that there's no universe where this looks bad, and as the guy who played this part, it didn't feel bad either. But you can't say it's not lacking a certain level of punch and impact that the original had. It seems to me Remedy saw RE2 Remake's third-person movement and combat and thought to themselves, well, why don't we just do that? And to be very clear, I thought RE2 Remake's combat and movement was great 99% of the time. The same thing technically going for Alan Wake 2. So this isn't me saying that combat was bad in this game, it's just me saying I wish they wouldn't have radically changed it from the first one. I just don't see any of this as an upgrade in any significant way, so I'm left wondering why it was altered in the first place. The answer most likely being the fact that third-person games nowadays would be laughed out of the room if their cameras weren't glued to the character's back and zoomed in so far that they take up 75% of the screen. And finally, at least as far as this rant on combat goes, is something that could be seen as a plus or a minus. Alan Wake 2, in its roughly 30 hours of gameplay, has what seems to be significantly less combat opportunities than its predecessor at a far reduced runtime, which I think might feed into one of my previous complaints. With the ridiculous amount of gameplay mechanics and systems sharing the same game, it makes sense none of them would get enough of a chance to shine quite as bright, which actually wasn't supposed to be an Alan Wake joke, but now I'm seeing it very much is.
Spies are always watching.
Alright, so cards on the table, what's the verdict here? Because even I can see that this video has been all over the place. Well, first I want to say that Alan Wake 2 is an amazingly fun video game with an involving story that speaks to the parts of my brain that enjoys both Twin Peaks and the X-Files. It is also jam-packed with content. I was able to beat the main game in about 20 to 25 hours, and I've already put another 5 into the final draft mode to the point where I've nearly 100%ed the thing. And I can assure you I do not put this much time into stuff I don't enjoy, this YouTube channel notwithstanding. So it should probably go without saying that I fully recommend playing it. But in that same breath, I also have to be honest and say there were a lot of aspects to the game that I was very disappointed by. Aside from it leaving nearly every ounce of the original's gameplay in the dust, it feels full to the point of bursting, which means I never got a chance to sit and really enjoy any specific system aside from the ones that were wildly mishandled. To be totally honest though, I would assume most people would not have the same issues I've had, and I think I might know why. It's kinda hard to say this out loud, but fuck it, here it goes. Guys, I'm just getting old. I have lived long enough to have seen gaming's meteoric rise in the 80s, and I've been able to watch it grow from a boutique hobby that was likely to get your ass kicked in school to the dominant form of entertainment on the planet. And that's amazing, but I've also lived long enough to watch every single one of the franchises that I grew up with leave me behind for an audience with less joint pain and better eyesight. I've watched Max Payne turn into a cover-based shooter, Final Fantasy drop its RPG roots in favor of Diet Devil May Cry, and Resident Evil try every form of gameplay other than survival horror. Man, things are just different now. And while that's not mine, yours, or Remedy's fault, it does sort of explain why I was hoping to see a title from my past come back in a form that I recognized. So I guess if you've yet to move into the old folks' home with the rest of the 30-year-olds, feel free to jump into this one with absolutely no worries. But if you have to check the obituaries every day to make sure you're not in them, like myself, maybe temper your expectations to a great video game that sort of resembles Alan Wake.
It was disturbing finding myself in the story this way. But I was desperate, and it felt right for the story.
Well, hey, thank you very much for making it to the end of this psychotic rant in the form of a video. I've been trying some different stuff with the way I format these scripts, and as you can tell by the amount of time it took to finish this, it's been a little tougher than I first expected. So if you notice something you like or that stood out as kinda cringe, do me a favor and let me know in the comments section. I'd love a bit of feedback as to how these videos are going to continue into the future. But until that vague future arrives, I'm very happy to have shared a little chunk of my mind with you. Stay safe, guys, and I'll see you all later. Hey, we did it. We made a single video in the amount of time it should have taken to make 5. If you enjoyed my perspective or want to help this series continue, feel free to check out my Patreon or join up as a channel member here on YouTube. I don't think I mentioned this as much as I should, but supporting me at any level on either platform gets you access to my Discord server where we mostly talk about music, upscaling, and old video games. But hey, if you can't spare that kind of monthly expense, I 100% understand, and I can't thank you enough for just making it this far into the video. I hope all you guys have a good one, and I will most definitely see you next time.